Welcome, everyone. I am Yeva Yusanita, and I'm the director of the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. And today I have an immense pleasure to welcome to Brown University and to the Watson School, Boston's former mayor, Kim Janey. Mayor Janey is here to be in conversation with Brown's own Professor Keisha Blain, whose new book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights, has just come out, and it is the reason we're all here. And in about half an hour, the Brown Bookstore will have books for sale outside the room, so you can get your copy and get Professor Blain sign it. This is a story of Black women as intellectuals, as thinkers who fought for and who advanced human rights and civil rights in the United States as well as abroad, and on the global stage. Actually, I heard that this book the working title of the book was A Global Struggle. So maybe we'll hear more about that. Henry Louis Gates called Without Fear an epic journey through time, which shines a light on the two often overlooked generations of Black American women who, from the ground up, advanced the cause of human rights at home and abroad. Publishers Weekly described the book as a thoroughly researched and invigorating look at a robust grassroots push for human rights in the 20th century. So after the conversation between Professor Blain and Mayor Janey, we will invite questions from the audience. And as I mentioned, Brown Bookstore will have books available for sale. Thank you. Before I introduce our speakers, I also wanted to thank Maggie Murphy, who basically made this whole event happen. So thank you, Maggie. Maggie's the program manager for the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. Okay, so now let me introduce our speakers. Keisha Blain is professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University. She's a Guggenheim, Carnegie, and New America Fellow and a New York Times bestselling author. She's a prolific writer and has published 8 books, including the multi-prize winning book Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women and the Global Struggle for Freedom in 2018. And Until I Am Free, Fannie Lou Hamer's Enduring Message to America in 2021, which was the National Book Critics Circle Award finalist. Kim Janey made history when in 2021, she became the first woman and the first Black person to serve as the mayor of Boston. Ms. Janey has 30 years of experience in community organizing, advocacy, policy development, and coalition building. She now leads Economic Mobility Pathways, a national nonprofit working to help people experiencing deep poverty climb the economic ladder. Before joining Empath, Ms. Janey served as a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she led a study group on racial justice and recovery, leading American cities to a more equitable future. And most recently, Mayor Janey was named as a 2023 Aspen Institute Ascent Fellow. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, I am just grateful to be here with Dr. Keisha Blain. I think this is a really important conversation. It is a really timely conversation when we think about everything that is happening in our world right now. When we think of what is happening specifically to Black women in our world right now, I think this is the conversation we need to continue to encourage ourselves and inspire us. And this goes way beyond attacks of DEI. I mean, we can look at the spike and the unemployment rate for Black women. We are under attack, as are many groups. And so to focus on human rights and that struggle and the making of human rights is just an important conversation. And I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Blain on the earlier book, Wake Up America, and then again with your Fannie Lou Hamer book, who is a big, big, big hero of mine. And so I'm just thrilled to be here for Without Fear. Maybe we can just start the conversation with telling the audience what inspired you to write this book and to tell these important stories. When I think about my own education and knowing and learning about some of the women that you highlight here, it was always in the frame of civil rights and not human rights. So I really would love to hear what motivated you to write the book, and how do you think your book challenges us in what we know about Black women and their point in time throughout our history?
Yes, well, first.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here. And thank you so much, Mayor Janey, for agreeing to do this. And thank you also for your kind support over the years. So why did I write this book, or what inspired me to write this book? I actually started writing this book while I was in the process of finishing up the book on Fannie Lou Hamer. And largely because as I was writing the book on Fannie Lou Hamer, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to frame Hamer, how to talk about her as, of course, an activist, but also as an intellectual. I started thinking about how we might situate Hamer as a global thinker, and how we might really grapple with the way that she thought about not solely what was taking place in the context of the United States, but what was happening globally. And this is a particular aspect, I think, her story that has not been, I think, has not been well documented. And in fact, in the book on Hamer, I included a chapter on, I talk about her internationalism. I talk about her trip to Guinea in 1964. I talk about her meetings with Sekou Touré. I talk about what it meant to be with African nationalists and grappling with the fight to end colonialism, and then to return to the United States and to connect what she was seeing in the Mississippi Delta to what was happening in Congo, as just one example. And there's a moment in the book where I emphasize how Hamer argued that I'm no longer fighting for equal rights, I'm now fighting for human rights. And sometimes she would say it a different way. I'm no longer fighting for civil rights, I'm now fighting for human rights. Part of what I think she was doing was essentially making an argument that, yes, she was certainly interested in the expansion of voting rights. She was certainly interested in the expansion of Black political rights. And the question of citizenship was one that deeply concerned her. But I think the phrase was important because it really signaled how she felt that the fight was ultimately larger than a question of citizenship, that in fact the stakes were higher, that in fact what Black people needed, and of course this is in the context of the 1960s, were human rights, rights that were effectively divinely inspired, God-given rights that no one could take away, and that these rights she could claim, which is important because it's not a question of whether it's a guarantee in the U.S. Constitution or whether or not the federal government needs to acknowledge those rights. Of course, that's a conversation to have. But I think Hamer was really getting to an important argument here, and that is that the struggle for the expansion of Black rights needed to be thought of in a more expansive way. And of course, when you're writing a book, there's only so much you could accomplish. And I knew that I needed to delve deeper. And the question for me was, what is the history of human rights, and how would I tell this history if I centered Black women? What would a human rights history look like if I placed at the center of the narrative a group that has been, for the most part, marginalized in this history? And what would it mean to not start with the 1940s, as some scholars do, or even the 1970s, as other scholars do? But what would it mean to take a step back, to start in the 1830s, where we have the first documented speeches of a Black woman, Maria Stewart, in the 1830s in the city of Boston? And so I knew that this was a story that would certainly be connected to Hamer's, but it was a separate book I needed to write. And so I started doing so in earnest. And quite frankly, it's been a remarkable journey. I've learned a lot in the process. And what I've learned in the process is that even though we often talk about human rights in a way that feels so foreign and external, which is to say there is so much emphasis on European philosophers and thinkers, right? We think about someone like Nietzsche as an example, very important in this history. But the question I'm asking is, how do Black women effectively shape human rights history? How do they make it their own? How do they take this concept and to be specific, these core ideals, and how do they turn them into an organizing principle that effectively shapes their local politics, their national politics, and their global politics? And so to answer that question, I move through many cities, across time, across space. I center women from diverse backgrounds in terms of their social status. And I think what unfolds is effectively a human rights history from the ground up. It's not that the UN isn't in this book. It is, but I focus intentionally on the people who are silent in the history, the Black women who are sitting in the room whose names are not even showing up in the historical record. Someone like Sabella Culpepper. Who is that? Well, she happens to be one of the first Black women hired at the UN, and she's there simply to take notes. But her presence matters. And I talk about Priscilla McDonald, another Black woman, the only Black woman sitting in the room at multiple moments, right? 1946, taking notes. And they're invisible, I think, for so many people because they're just there to take notes. But I push beyond that invisibility to ask a question: what does it mean for Black women to be in that space? What are the ways they were able to affect change when they don't have an official title, when they don't have a seat at the table, if you will? And I go through the creative ways that they shape this history. And it truly is a remarkable story in which I learned a lot in the process. And I certainly hope that others do as well.
Absolutely. There was so much there to unpack. You mentioned Europeans being centered when we talk about human rights, often men.
Yes.
And you centering Black women, what I truly appreciated was Black women from all walks of life, Black women with little means, Fannie Lou Hamer as a sharecropper, all the way back to Madam C.J. Walker, who we all know was the first millionaire, Black woman millionaire in the United States. Talk about, as you go all the way back to the 19th century, talk about how difficult it was to find these records. You mentioned women who were invisible, who still today in 2025 are fighting for their place to be seen, to be heard, to be listened to be trusted, whether in a doctor's office or whether in their quest for human rights. So speak to the process of uncovering documents going all the way back to the 19th century and those stories of these unsung heroes who would just show up in a space, who would just insist on being heard. And share some of those stories with us.
Yes, and this is, I think, an important aspect of the story because people write about human rights in various ways. I think even for all of us gathered here, we could talk about human rights in multiple different ways. Oftentimes, the focus is very much a top-down discussion, whether we're discussing nation states or discussing diplomats. I think people are very invested in the more formal expressions, if you will, or the more formal roles. And I was deeply committed to not centering that particular aspect of the story. So what did I have to do? Well, of course, I utilized archival material. That was important, but I think it's also clear by now that archives are both useful, but can be limited in terms of the voices captured and the perspectives. We certainly understand the bias of the archive. So I needed to utilize a number of sources. And one particular source that I found so useful for this story, especially in the 19th century, was historical newspapers, as an example. Finding Black women grappling with human rights. And what do I mean? And I've heard scholars, there's one scholar in particular who has said things like, well, human rights doesn't actually enter the everyday lexicon, right, or the discourse until maybe 1940s, and would point to the actual use, right, the actual use of the term human rights that appear in newspapers. That's important. I do think it's important to grapple with terms and when they're used. But I actually think that approach is quite limited. And so what I needed to do was figure out, what am I searching for? Well, there were three core tenets that I was looking for. One, how were Black women thinking about equal rights? How are they thinking about universality, right? Universal rights. How are they thinking about natural rights? And being able to then go to the text or through newspaper articles, for example, or to find text of speeches. So in the case of Mariah Stewart, thankfully, we do have documentation of her speeches, sometimes sermons that she's giving in churches, or some of her own writings. And I'm able to do a very close read to figure out what exactly is she saying when she's making an argument that slavery must come to an end. How is she framing that argument? And what becomes quite clear is she is in fact talking about human rights. And so it was really, I think, paying attention to what women are saying. A similar example of this is in the case of Ida B. Wells. People talk about Ida B. Wells often, certainly an anti-lynching crusader in the context of U.S. history. And oftentimes the story stops there. And what I needed to do was pay attention to what Wells was saying, to see the way that she's drawn a connection between lynching that's taking place in the U.S. And what's happening in Cuba. There's a moment where she writes a piece saying essentially the racial violence that Black people are enduring is akin to, a genocide that's taking place in other parts of the world. She's saying that in the 19th century. And she's speaking these words as she's traveling throughout the UK in the late 19th century. So it was a matter of paying attention to what these women were saying, what they're writing, and then being able to pull the stories together. Now you can imagine as we move forward in time, women do in fact say human rights, right? And then of course they're using different terms. Of course, the establishment of the United Nations is a pivotal moment where you see a shift taking place in the book itself, as a shift is taking place, right, in U.S. and global history with the presence of this important international body. But part of what I do is I stay close to these materials, and then to the latter chapters, I utilize some oral history. The last chapter of the book, I talk about Amadou Diallo's mother, Khady Diallo. And many of you might know Amadou Diallo, who was tragically gunned down by New York City police in 1999, shot at 41 times while just standing in front of his apartment building. And I interviewed his mother and spent a lot of time with her to try to understand is effectively her human rights advocacy, what that meant in the context of the 1990s, what that meant in the 2000s, and quite frankly, what that means in the current moment. And so it was truly a gathering of sources. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, many of these women, because they are new in the sense that other people have not written on them, I needed to dig a lot, especially with census records. There are, in fact, some women who I discuss in this book who I've been gathering information about for 10 years, at least. That is true for Pearl Sherrod. I've been obsessed with her, and it has taken me. Yes, we will talk about her. It is yes. And when I first encountered her a little over 10 years ago, I pulled together what I could, but I knew that there was more to find, and I continued digging, and with time, I've been able to gather enough to be able to return to her. And then Marguerite Cartwright as another, Aretha McKinley. So there are new figures in the book which pushed me to piece together their lives beyond what I could find in the archive, beyond what I could find in the historical newspaper, and so on.
Yes, and using that political and social context to do so. I'd love to just share an excerpt. You mentioned Sherrod, and I just thought she was fascinating as I was reading about her in the book. Many of my team members and in my workplace know I use a certain phrase when talking about people who look like you and I, and maybe some others in this room. And it's captured right here. Here. So let me read. It says, one of the key aspects of Sherrod's column, and this is a column in the Detroit paper, was her focus on human rights issues. She took advantage of the space to address inequalities in various parts of the globe. Writing in the Detroit Tribune in June of 1934, Sherrod brought attention to some of the challenges non-white people were facing in nations under colonial rule in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Let me remind you that fully 3/4 of the population of the world are colored people and only 1/4 are white, she stated. But the greater part of the colored world is today under white political control. And by emphasizing the sheer volume of people of color, Sherrod sent a message of empowerment to readers, reminding them that they had the power to defeat white supremacy. Now, that phrase that I use when talking, some people use BIPOC. I'm very clear to talk about the global majority when I talk about people. And I loved seeing how back in 1934, before I coined, and I'm not even sure I coined that phrase, before I adopted that phrase, that she was already kind of centering our struggle in this human rights struggle, and one that was global, one that meant to connect other folks across the globe. And so I'd love to hear more about Sherrod and others who made a way in the 1930s to get to Europe, all these women who were going to places and showing up and insisting on being heard and seen. I read one woman, I can't remember if it was Sherrod, who went to the this conference with Asian women and white. Yes. Please tell us more about Sherrod.
Yes. So Pearl Sherrod is someone who is such a fascinating figure. And it's important to know that this is a working class Black woman. Yes. And quite frankly, I think working poor is perhaps more precise. And she's a working poor Black woman living in Detroit in the 1930s. I'm able to, through census records, find out that she was born in Alabama. I'm able to trace her life as she moves from Alabama to West Virginia, and then from West Virginia to Detroit. And by the time she makes it to Detroit, she is essentially a single mother. She has these 2 children she's raising. Her husband, according to her, abandoned her. And she, in these early years, gets involved in the Nation of Islam. I talk about the significance of the Nation of Islam as both a religious and political space. And that point of the history is important to emphasize because it also helps to explain, I think, her internationalism, the way that she's weaving connections, the way that she's thinking about Afro-Asian solidarity. In particular, she's very interested in this notion of African Americans forging an alliance with Japan. And again, in the 1930s, this, of course, is true in the context of the Nation of Islam. We can see that history there. One of the reasons that I do find Sherrod is because she shows up unexpectedly in Vancouver, Canada, in 1937. And she shows up at the Pan-Pacific. It's essentially a Pan-Pacific Women's Association. They're holding a conference. They do this annually. Sherrod, it's unclear how Sherrod learned about this gathering, but what is clear is she's not invited to this gathering. And yet she essentially crashes the party. It's interesting when you read the primary sources, I chuckle still the way various people who attended documented in their journal, this, of course, I'm saying African-American, you can imagine the lexicon of the time, but this African-American woman just showed up. She walked to the podium and she grabbed the mic and she just started speaking and scolding us and telling us all these things. And it's quite remarkable because what she does is she shows up at this gathering. She walks up and she just commands attention and she says to them, whatever is, and I'm paraphrasing, whatever you think you're doing here, really, it doesn't mean much if you're not going to think about Black people. What kind of vision of human rights are you actually espousing if you're not thinking about the condition of Black people? certainly Black women. And again, this is 1937. And the speech, journalists write about it. It becomes a very important moment because it's shocking on the one hand, but it really shows in real time this idea of someone making their voice heard, right? Making their demands known, and doing so and calling out white women and calling out Asian women who are present, because there are no Black women in the room. So that's important to understand. And so she's clearly must have been aware of this before she showed up, and she's admonishing them and telling them that their vision of human rights is incomplete if they're not going to consider the plight and the condition of Black people. What I talk about in the book is that it's not just a powerful speech. It's not just a speech that people write about. It's not just how she captures the moment. It's how she changes the organization. They ultimately change their policy. And what they do is they begin to open up a space for Black women. They invite Black women to their gatherings. And one of the reasons that they do that, right, is because of that powerful speech, the recognition that their whole vision is limited if they're going to exclude a particular group of people. And so Sherrod is someone who, that's the first time she captures my attention. And of course, I'm asking, who is this woman? Then I realized she's involved in an organization called the Development of Our Own. It's a movement for Afro-Asian political solidarity. Then I find out that she was at a time married to Japanese radical Satokata Takahashi. She married him in the 1930s. That raises eyebrows too, because people are like, what is happening? This woman, she's involved with this radical. And her story is so fascinating too. There's so much I can say about her, clearly. But her story is fascinating too, because she's a woman, she's invisible to so many people. So even when federal authorities show up, and they show up at her apartment at one point, because they are trying to squash these movements, right? These are radical movements, again, 1930s. They're trying to figure out who's pushing these ideas, who's trying to encourage Black folks to ally with Japan. Too dangerous of a thought. And they show up at her apartment. Her husband isn't there. By that point, he's been deported, sent back to Japan. And they see her, and they see that she's hosting a dinner party, and it's documented in the FBI records. Like, oh, nothing's happening here. Just the wife having a gathering. What they don't know is that's the gathering in which she's keeping the movement going, right? So she's invisible to them, and yet she plays such a powerful role. And I talk about her writing. She takes over her husband's column in the newspaper. Just really remarkable for the time period. And why do I tell this story? Because I'm trying to, once again, send a message that the history of human rights cannot be solely about what happens at the top and what trickles to the bottom, but it's also individuals making these kinds of moves, these kinds of concerted decisions that ultimately make a difference. Yes, it's small, right? It's not the kind of thing we would talk about today, but it's powerful nonetheless. And it's happening at a moment where these women are not even recognized as citizens of the United States. Really, there's really no way to explain it otherwise. But to say that people who are still fighting to be accepted, to be viewed with any kind of respect, to receive any kind of respect, or to receive any kind of recognition that they too are part of this national polity, that they are still invested in a broader vision of human rights that doesn't just account for expanding opportunities and rights for themselves, but for all people. And they're doing so decades before, right? Even again, 1930s, before the United Nations, before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, before the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the context of U.S. history. So much I can say, but Pearl Sherrod, I think, is a good window into what human rights looks like from the ground up.
Yes. And for the audience, we will be opening it up with some questions, just a few more items. You mentioned before the United Nations. I'm thinking back to the movie Hidden Figures and the role that Black women played in getting us to the moon. Talk more about others who played a role in the United Nations. And then I'd love for you to maybe end on, before we open it up, why it is important to tell these stories of folks who have been marginalized, who have been invisible, and how this impacts our future, how we might leverage and learn from this moving forward so that we don't continue to repeat some of the issues and challenges that we've had along our history here in the States.
Yes, absolutely. So to the United Nations, I certainly talk about Mary McLeod Bethune. And in fact, the title of the book comes from a quote from Bethune in 1944. She's talking to a group of Black women and emphasizing the importance of human rights advocacy, emphasizing the importance of forging transnational alliances. And she tells them to do so without fear and hesitancy. And so it's important to talk about Bethune because, as we all know, she played a role in helping to draft the Charter of the United Nations. I certainly talk about that. But one of the other things that I do is I talk about women who are connected to the United Nations in other ways that we don't often pay attention to. And so one woman who I spend a lot of time discussing is Marguerite Cartwright. And Marguerite Cartwright is a correspondent to the United Nations. She does many things. She wears many hats. She's a professor at Hunter College in the city, University of New York. And she's a columnist for the Pittsburgh Courier, and she's also a columnist for the New York Amsterdam News. But one of the things that she's doing is she's traveling extensively, sometimes using research funds, sometimes getting support from one of the newspapers, and she's paying close attention to what's happening globally, including attending UN gatherings, in order to report back to an African-American audience, essentially. Part of why she's doing this is because she believes strongly that the United Nations is, in fact, a vehicle for Black women, certainly, but for Black people broadly, to advocate for, of course, human rights, but also to advocate for civil rights to an extent. And she's very invested in seeing the two as interconnected. One of the things that I discuss in the book is how in 1958, she attends the All African Peoples Conference in Accra, Ghana, with Kwame Nkrumah and many others. And she's one of only about 8 women who are present in this gathering. She's not involved in any of the official conversations. She's literally there and she's walking around and she's observing and she's taking notes. What she then will do after she leaves this gathering is she goes back to the US and then she writes a series of columns in which she's explaining for an American audience, and specifically for Black Americans, she's explaining how what's taking place in Accra, Ghana is important, and how what's taking place is very much part of a larger struggle for expanded rights. She's drawn a link between the fight to end colonialism on the African continent and also the ongoing struggle on US soil for civil rights. And so she becomes really just a powerful connector. And so it's not just the writing, but it's also, at one point, she's introducing various African leaders to civil rights activists. There's a moment where I talk about how she's making sure that Martin Luther King Jr., that he has an invitation to celebrations that are taking place surrounding independence in Ghana, or there are just these moments where she's literally walking through Harlem as dignitaries are visiting from different parts of Africa, and she's taking them through Harlem and making sure they're meeting with business owners, that they're meeting with people on the street. And her thinking is, I have to be the one to really draw these connections because it matters. These two struggles are not separate. They're deeply intertwined. And so she becomes someone invested in this kind of work. And to the question of the United Nations, at one point, she's even scolding readers, Black American readers. She's saying, you're not invested enough in the work of the United Nations. And granted, there is a history here, right? By the time we get to Margaret Cartwright calling out Black readers for not being as invested as she thinks they should be, well, we already know this is after William Patterson pushed, the We Charge Genocide petition, 1951, right? There are all these moments where Black people do, in fact, appeal to the UN, and they don't get the response that they're desiring. And so there is a sense that, well, this isn't going to be the space. This isn't going to be the vehicle. And Margaret Cartwright has a different perspective. She's a bit more optimistic, and she's deeply invested in holding on to the promise of the UN and pushing that narrative through her column. So it is very much, I think, grappling with the kinds of stories that don't generally take center stage. And to your larger question of why it matters, well, I think it matters for many reasons. I think at a practical level, as I'm grappling with, as I'm sure we all are grappling with many things that are happening in the moment, it's easy to feel powerless. And I think when we pay attention to these women's stories, we realize that actually we do have power. And it may look a bit different, right? I mean, there's certainly the power of the person who holds a title. To use the analogy of the seat at the table, there's the power of the people who are sitting at the table. But many of these women are not sitting at the table. They're not even necessarily welcomed into the room, but it doesn't stop them from doing the work that's important to them. And so it is, I think, a lesson for many of us in this moment is figuring out ways we could affect change through, at times, these informal processes, and perhaps in the moments where other people may not see the significance, but we do. And it's worth, I think, to fight for what we believe in.
Yes, yes. Alice Walker says that the biggest way that people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. That is the way they give up their power. If you had to pick one thing, we're going to open it up just 1 second, but if one takeaway, just one thing, and I know it's hard because we've heard such a rich discussion. Have we not? Have we heard a rich discussion? Okay, so just one takeaway. If you wanted folks to walk away from this room with, what would it be?
Well, I actually think it goes back to the title. Granted, there is a story there, as you can imagine, when it comes to deciding the title of the book. And it was not my original plan, I will admit that. But there is something to be said about the message that Mary McLeod Bethune gave to Black women in 1944. We can think about just the context. Certainly, this is World War II era. There's a lot happening at the moment. Surveillance, the list goes on in terms of what Black women and Black people and other marginalized groups were dealing with. And it struck me that she would stand up in this public forum and say to them, we need to do this. And it's not just that we need to do it, but we need to do it without fear and hesitancy. And I've reflected a lot on that. And I think that this is perhaps the one takeaway that I hope people will reflect on. It's not to say that we can't feel fear. I think it's human to be fearful, but we also can't allow it to stop us. And I think to say that we need to do it without fear and hesitancy is to at least encourage us to push beyond those feelings, to really do the work that we are committed to doing. So I hope that's the message that people will leave with.
Yes. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Dr. Blain for that very great discussion, really centering these amazing stories. We want to open it up to the audience. I'm not sure if there are mics. Can someone yes, thank you. People want to line up, or we can just bring the mic to you. First question from the audience. Anyone? Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so my question is, many of these movements were led by Black women who were working class or even sometimes mothers, with necessities like SNAP and other healthcare benefits under attack. How do you see or predict the shift in the faces of the movement when tools they use to get by are under attack?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that in studying Black women's history, I've really marveled at the creativity and the ways that women do find the ability to keep working toward their goals, even when they're facing a number of challenges. And so it's not to dismiss the very real challenges, right? In the case of Pearl Sherrod, having to grapple with what we talk about as bread and butter issues, or having to really question, how will I put food on the table, right? That's a question. And being able to hold that alongside, and how do I advocate for human rights for all people? How do I stay deeply invested in this work? That has been, I think, truly inspiring, because we do, I think, live in a very, one would say, individualistic kind of society, where oftentimes it is about, right, what we need in the moment or what we don't have, and it's not to dismiss these concerns. We should certainly be thinking about our needs. But my point is, I'm struck by the fact that in the historical context, even when people didn't have everything they needed, it didn't stop them from doing the work. And granted, there could have been many moments, and you see this in the book, where people could have easily put up their hands. You see that in the context of the women who I write about in the 7th chapter, who are organizing, who are writing in Freedom Ways, a group of women who aligned with the communist left. They're dealing with multiple challenges. They are making arguments about expanded rights, and at the same time, they're being surveilled. And at the same time, they're being arrested. And at the same time, they're being blocked when they try to travel abroad. And they're losing their jobs because of their political views. And all of these things are happening. And yet you have someone like Esther Cooper Jackson, who stays editing that paper for 25 years amidst all of that. And so I guess all that is to say that I think that the Black people, Black women certainly, even with the loss of jobs and the loss of benefits, and these are real concerns, to be sure, I think they will continue to be invested in this work. And I think too that they will turn to other spaces in which to find the support. What really emerges in this book is the power of community. At times, sometimes religious spaces, sometimes political spaces. I talk about the Black Women's Club movement as spaces where sometimes those were the only spaces women could turn at various junctures. That is important to know, because it's not that people don't expect the government to provide certain kinds of services and protections, but it's simply that people aren't necessarily waiting on those, because they've lived long enough to know that it's simply not a guarantee. And my sense is that Black women in the contemporary moment will likely respond in a similar way. Obviously, people respond differently, but I do think there will be many who decide, despite these challenges, it's important to continue doing this work and to partner with others who are like-minded.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. If there's, please. Is there a mic right here?
Hello. Thank you so much for coming today. I really enjoyed hearing you speak. So when I think about Black women in the making of human rights, the first thing that really comes to mind is the transformation of the reproductive justice movement that was led by Sister Song, Loretta Ross, and many other Black women, and how reframing that movement opened it up to advocate for so many more people, but also change the conversation from choice to rights. Mm-hmm. So my question for you is, what are some other contemporary movements that we are in right now that need to adapt that similar framing of inflicting human rights to take away the concept of choice that is often politicized and allow it to be advocated for in a more effective way?
Yeah. That's a great question. Well, what comes to mind immediately, and this I think is an example of that certainly comes from the book. And I recognize that a lot has shifted, a lot has changed, quite frankly, since I started writing the book and since the book came out. Nowadays, when you talk about Black Lives Matter, people cringe in a way that they weren't doing so just a couple of years ago. But I'll bring it up and say that one of the things that struck me that I don't think people paid as much attention to was the way that someone like Ayo, formerly Opal Tometi, who I talk about in the last chapter, the way that she and others made a very, I think, bold and important argument that it wasn't just about challenging state-sanctioned violence because it was evidence of anti-Black racism, like all of that matters, but it was also recognizing that this was a human rights question, right? That part of this narrative of recognizing that there are certain God-given rights and protections, quite simply, that includes the right to be able to walk outside of your apartment and stand right while minding your own business and not having to be shot at 41 times, right? I mean, to allude to Amadou Diallo. And Amadou Diallo's mother says this to me as we're talking through, and I'm trying to understand her ideas about human rights and what motivates her to do the work that she's been doing. And she said this very thing to me. She said, there was a moment where people were talking about police brutality, police violence, right? State-sanctioned violence. All of these things were important, but in framing it that way, then you have people, well, no, you're bad talking the police, or they're a good police, and they're okay, fine. But that's actually not the issue, is it? It's that it is in fact a violation of human rights. And she said that once she recognized the importance of framing it that way, then people started to listen. And I think, and granted, as I said, a lot has changed since then, but I do think there's a way in which people are generally more open to having the conversation when we frame things a certain way. And I really spend a lot of time thinking about the power of language. And you see that, I think, with Black Lives Matter, a lot of people just didn't listen for a range of reasons. But when Opal, formerly Opal Tometi, stood up at the United Nations as one of the founders of Black Lives Matter and made the argument that, in fact, this is a human rights abuse and needs to be recognized as such, I don't think that received nearly enough attention as it should have. But it's certainly the case that she's been making, that Patrisse Cullors has been making, and others in the movement. So that's one example, I think, in terms of a contemporary example. You're welcome.
Last question. And then we will have books available, I believe. Yeah, wonderful. Sir, please.
There's nobody else. Okay. Thank you, Professor Blain and Mayor Janey. What an honor to have both of you here. So, as an outsider to African American history and Black women's history more broadly, when I think of your title, I haven't read the book yet, of human rights and Black history, I think of Malcolm. Yeah. I think of, maybe Winnie Mandela, closer to the topic. And you're clearly predating, which is a wonderful historical craft and thing to do, to bring it back much earlier. Yeah. So my question for you is, so if not Malcolm and Winnie Mandela, 60s to the 80s, 1960s, who would be the individuals that would start a human rights class? I mean, in general, not just Black, So is it in the 19th century, 18th century? If you could just give us some of those individuals.
Well, actually, I alluded to Esther Cooper Jackson earlier, and my sense is that she would certainly be someone I would emphasize in this story. As you're asking me about the kind of 1960s moment, I mentioned Freedom Ways. And for those who don't know, a very important periodical from about the 1960s to the 1980s. Part of why it's established is to provide a somewhat of a counter narrative to the mainstream newspapers, a space where not only Black socialists can really, I think, articulate their views, but a space in which to even complicate some of the ideas that are circulating at the time around integration. So so Black nationalism shows up in the space, Black radical politics broadly in all of its expressions. I mentioned that because part of what they're doing through the newspaper is trying to, I think, really help people understand human rights, what it means, but also how it applies and should apply broadly to other marginalized groups. The specific issues, for example, they publish a number of issues on South Africa as an example to talk about the anti-apartheid movement and to help readers think through why it's important to link what's happening in South Africa to the struggle for rights in the U.S. So there's a way in which I think those writers, including Shirley Graham Du Bois, of course, her husband is a bit more famous, but you see her as a writer, an important thinker at this moment. I think those are two who I would emphasize. And I would quickly mention someone who's not as well known, but who I introduced in the book. And her name is Aretha McKinley. And Aretha McKinley is an African-American woman, lobbyist in D.C. And one of the things that she does throughout the 1960s, she is organizing and hosting a series of workshops, many of them held at Howard University, in which she is helping people think through these ideas, grappling with the dual commitment to fighting for civil and human rights. So I think those are just a few examples of intellectuals who, granted, may not be as well known as, of course, Malcolm X or Winnie Mandela, but are still very much interested in informing a general public around these issues. And to your question of holding classes, so to speak, those will be the ones I would emphasize.
Great. If there are no other questions, no burning questions, we will move on. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for coming to hear from Dr. Blain. Really powerful conversation. I want to thank the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies. And of course, Dr. Blain, please join me in showing your gratitude to Dr. Keisha Blain. Her book is available for sale right outside these rooms. There is more food, and you can get an autographed copy. All right?